The moment Graham Mercer jokingly told the most powerful woman in the company that his little boy needed a mom, the smile disappeared from her face. She stared at him as if he had accidentally spoken the one sentence she had spent her entire life trying not to hear. What Graham didn't know was that behind Vivian Hart's flawless designer clothes, billion-dollar company, and carefully controlled life was a woman carrying a secret heartbreak so deep that his innocent joke would soon force her to confront everything she had been running from. If you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel, because sometimes the family we need is the family we never expected to find. Graham had learned long ago that being a single father meant becoming many people at once. He was a father before sunrise, a cook before breakfast, a homework helper after school, a nurse when little Callum caught a cold, and a construction supervisor during the hours when he had to earn enough money to keep their small apartment warm and their refrigerator full. He had not planned for life to turn out this way. 3 years earlier, his wife, Elise, had walked out after telling him that she couldn't live the life of a struggling young mother anymore. She had left without taking Callum, who was only 4 at the time, and Graham had never spoken badly about her in front of his son. He simply told Callum that sometimes adults made choices they later regretted, and that none of it was the child's fault. Now Callum was 7, bright-eyed, endlessly curious, and far more mature than a child his age should have needed to be. He knew when his father was tired. He knew when the electricity bill was sitting unopened on the kitchen counter. He knew that when Graham came home with dust on his boots and pain in his shoulders, the best thing he could do was wrap his tiny arms around his father's waist and say, "You're home." That little sentence could make an entire terrible day disappear. Graham worked on a major renovation project inside an old historic building that was being transformed into the headquarters of Hartwell Enterprises, one of the fastest-growing technology and real estate companies in the country. Graham wasn't an executive or an architect. He was the site supervisor responsible for coordinating contractors, inspecting materials, and making sure every part of the renovation met the company's demanding standards. He was respected because he never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. If a worker was carrying heavy timber, Graham carried it beside him. If someone stayed late to fix a problem, Graham stayed too. That was how Vivian Hart first noticed him. Vivian was 38 and had built Hartwell Enterprises after inheriting almost nothing from her family except debt and a stubborn refusal to fail. She had transformed a small struggling property company into a national empire through discipline, intelligence, and an almost frightening ability to remain calm under pressure. People admired her. Some feared her. Almost nobody knew her. She arrived at the construction site one bright afternoon wearing a cream blazer, dark trousers, and an expression that made 3 senior managers immediately straighten their backs. She had come to inspect the progress herself because the building's grand opening was only weeks away, and she had already received complaints about delays. But before she could begin her inspection, she noticed a little boy sitting safely behind the marked construction area with a coloring book on his knees. Vivian frowned. She turned toward Graham, who was checking measurements near the staircase. Graham noticed her expression and immediately walked over. "I'm sorry," he said. "My sitter cancelled this morning. Callum had a school holiday, and I couldn't leave him alone. He's staying where I can see him." Vivian looked at the child. Callum glanced up and gave her a polite smile before returning to his drawing. "You brought your son to a construction site?" she asked. Graham swallowed. "I know it isn't ideal." Vivian expected him to become defensive, but instead he looked embarrassed. That softened something inside her. "I'll make sure he's nowhere near the work area," Graham added. "He's more responsible than half the adults I've worked with." For the first time, Vivian almost smiled. Callum overheard him and shouted, "Dad, that's not true." The workers laughed, and even Vivian let out a small laugh. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Vivian kept finding reasons to visit the construction site during the day. Officially, it was because she wanted to monitor the renovation. Unofficially, she had begun to enjoy seeing Callum sitting with his coloring pencils while Graham worked. The boy had a way of making the enormous unfinished building feel less cold. One afternoon, Vivian found Graham sitting on a wooden bench during his lunch break. Callum was beside him, eating a sandwich while telling his father an elaborate story about a school science project involving a volcano. Vivian stopped nearby. "You two always eat lunch together?" she asked. Graham smiled. "Whenever I can." Callum looked up. "Dad makes the best sandwiches." Vivian glanced at Graham's plain lunch and then at the expensive meal she had brought from an executive restaurant. "That's a bold claim." Callum nodded seriously. "It's true." Graham laughed. "He's biased." Vivian watched them for several seconds. There was something almost painful about the warmth between them. She suddenly realized she couldn't remember the last time someone had waited for her simply because they wanted to share lunch. She sat beside them. The conversation became surprisingly easy. Callum asked her whether she had children. Vivian hesitated. "No," she answered quietly. "Do you want kids?" Graham immediately looked horrified. "Callum. What?" "It's a normal question." Vivian surprised them both by laughing. "I suppose it is." Callum continued eating. Vivian looked at Graham. "You know, I sometimes wish I had a happy family like yours." Graham didn't think before answering. He smiled and said lightly, "My kid needs a mom." Silence. The words had been meant as a joke. But Vivian froze. Graham's smile faded when he saw her expression. "I didn't mean," she stood abruptly. "I have a meeting." Then she walked away. Graham watched her disappear through the doorway, completely confused. He didn't know that Vivian had once been engaged. Her fiancé, Adrian, had died in a car accident 6 years earlier, only 2 months before their wedding. Vivian had been pregnant at the time, but she lost the baby shortly afterward. She had never told anyone outside her family. She had buried herself in work and convinced herself that emotional distance was the only way to survive. The next day, Vivian didn't come to the construction site. Neither did she come the day after. Graham assumed she was angry with him. Then something far worse happened. Vivian's chief financial officer, Malcolm Reed, discovered that Graham had made an expensive mistake on a material order. The paperwork showed Graham's authorization on a shipment that had cost the company nearly $200,000 more than expected. Graham insisted he hadn't approved it. Malcolm produced the document. Vivian stared at Graham across her office. "I trusted you," she said. "I didn't sign that. The signature says otherwise." Graham felt his stomach drop. "I don't know how it got there." Vivian's expression hardened. "Then find out." He left the office humiliated. For the first time since Elise had abandoned him, Graham felt completely helpless. Losing the job would mean losing their apartment. It could mean taking Callum out of his school. It could mean admitting to his son that being a good father didn't always protect you from bad things. That evening, Callum noticed his father's silence. "Did I do something?" Graham immediately shook his head. "No, buddy. Is Ms. Hart mad at you?" Graham hesitated. "Maybe." Callum looked down at his coloring book. "I like her." Graham smiled sadly. "I do too." Callum looked up. "Then tell her." Graham laughed softly. "It's not that easy." But the following morning, Callum did something his father hadn't expected. He drew a picture of 3 people standing beneath a bright blue sky. There was a little boy in the middle, Graham on one side, and a woman with yellow hair on the other. He carried it into the office building himself. Vivian found him waiting outside her office. "What is this?" she asked gently. "Our family." Vivian's heart stopped. Callum pointed at the woman in the drawing. That's you. Vivian crouched down. You think I'm part of your family? Callum shrugged innocently. You make Dad smile. Vivian couldn't answer. She looked at the drawing again, and for the first time in years, the walls around her heart began to crack. Then Callum added, but if you don't want to be, that's okay. Dad says people get to choose. Vivian stared at him. That sentence broke something inside her. Because she had spent years believing that losing her baby meant she was never supposed to become a mother again. She touched the edge of the drawing. Your dad is a good man. I know. And you're a good son. I know that too. She laughed through sudden tears. Later that day, Vivian reopened the investigation into the material order. She discovered that the original authorization had been altered after Graham submitted it. Security footage showed Malcolm entering the records room. Further investigation revealed that Malcolm had been secretly redirecting company funds through a contractor he controlled. Vivian confronted him. He admitted everything. He had deliberately framed Graham because Graham had discovered irregularities in the construction accounts weeks earlier. Vivian immediately cleared Graham's name. But when she called him into her office, she didn't begin with the investigation. I'm sorry, she said. Graham stared at her. I should have believed you. He lowered his eyes. I understand why you didn't. No, Vivian replied. You don't. She told him about Adrian. She told him about the child she had lost. She told him that when Graham joked about Callum needing a mother, it had reminded her of everything she had lost and everything she had been too afraid to want again. Graham listened without interrupting. When she finished, he simply said, I'm sorry. Vivian wiped her eyes. I thought being strong meant never needing anyone. Graham smiled gently. Sometimes being strong means letting someone stay. That afternoon, Vivian went with Graham and Callum to a small park near the construction site. For the first time, she wasn't the CEO. She wasn't the woman who controlled a corporation. She was simply Vivian. Callum ran ahead to climb the playground structure while Graham and Vivian walked slowly behind him. I owe you an apology too, Graham said. For what? For that joke. Vivian smiled. It was a terrible joke. He laughed. I know. She looked toward Callum. He really does need a mom, doesn't he? Graham became quiet. Maybe someday. Vivian looked at him. And what about you? Graham didn't answer immediately. He had spent years protecting Callum from disappointment. He wasn't willing to bring someone into his son's life unless she truly intended to stay. Finally he said, I need someone who understands that my son comes first. Vivian nodded. I think I understand. Their relationship didn't become a fairy tale overnight. There were awkward conversations. There were fears. There were moments when Graham worried Vivian's world was too different from his. There were moments when Vivian wondered whether she could truly become the mother Callum imagined her to be. But they kept choosing each other. Vivian began attending Callum's school events. She learned his favorite foods. She sat beside him during homework. She listened to his endless stories about dinosaurs, rockets, and baseball. Graham watched her become attached to his son in a way that was not forced or performed. One afternoon, Callum fell asleep in the back seat after a long day at school. Vivian looked at him through the rearview mirror. I never thought I'd have this again, she whispered. Graham reached over and gently held her hand. You don't have to be afraid of being happy. She squeezed his fingers. I am. Me too. That was the truth. Neither of them knew exactly what the future would bring. But they had learned something more important than certainty. They had learned that love wasn't about finding people without scars. It was about finding people who were willing to hold your scars gently. Months later, the renovated headquarters opened. The entire company gathered for the ceremony, but Vivian ignored the cameras and executives for a moment. She walked straight toward Graham and Callum. Callum was holding a small bouquet of flowers. He handed it to her. "For you." Vivian smiled. "Why?" "Because Dad said you helped save his job." Graham shook his head. "I said she helped save more than that." Vivian looked at him. Callum grinned. "I think Dad likes you." Everyone around them laughed. Vivian looked at Graham. "I think I like him too." Graham smiled. Then Callum slipped his small hand into Vivian's. And in that simple moment, three lonely people stood together beneath the bright afternoon sky, no longer wondering whether they belonged somewhere. They had found home. Not because life had suddenly become perfect. Not because the past had disappeared. But because they had forgiven what could be forgiven, accepted what could not be changed, and chosen to love again. Graham had once joked that his kid needed a mom. He never imagined that the woman standing beside them would become the answer to a wish she had been too afraid to make. And Vivian had once believed her happiest days were behind her. She was wrong. Sometimes life takes away the family you thought you would have so that, one day, you can recognize the family you were never expecting. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you go, leave a comment telling us this: do you believe a broken heart can learn to love again when it finally finds the right people? Because sometimes the greatest second chance isn't a new beginning. It's discovering that love was waiting for you after you had already stopped looking.